Hello and welcome to Williams Mullen Video Legal Alert on recent developments in AI in the Commonwealth of Virginia. My name is Kevin Pomfret, and I am a corporate technology transactional attorney. And I'm pleased to welcome my colleague Dave Albo here to speak as well. Dave is a government relations attorney from Williams Mullen, and he also is a state lobbyist here at the firm. So Dave, first of all, welcome. Good to talk to you. You were a member of the state legislature, a delegate, I believe, for a number of years. Can you tell us how it works?
Well, I was a delegate from 1994 to 2017, so that's 24 years in public service. I always tell people I was 24 years undefeated and unindicted, which is my claim to fame. So the General Assembly works exactly like you learned in eighth grade. I mean, how a bill becomes a law. I know it's hard to believe that something you learn in eighth grade is actually the way it works, but that's how it does. What is interesting, though, is this is the 405th legislative session in Virginia. Virginia has the oldest continuously operating Democratic legislative body in the world. And we just finished our 405th session of this citizen legislature that was set up so many years ago.
How many bills were filed in this session?
Virginia does the same amount of work that United States Congress does, but they only do it in 2 months. It meets only in the wintertime. That was set up, back in the 1600s when people were farmers and they would come to the Capitol and just pass bills when they weren't planting. So there was 2,284 bills filed, and about half of them were passed, and they currently sit at the governor's desk waiting for his amendments or vetoes.
So one of the hot topics across the country, both at the federal and the state level, has been AI, artificial intelligence. Were there bills before the Virginia General Assembly this year regarding AI?
Well, there were a number of bills. It's kind of like this year's hot topic. The one that probably was the most sweeping was a bill. I'm going to read it here because it gets a little bit confusing. House Bill 747, Artificial Intelligence Developers Act. And what this bill basically did was set up regulations for AI developers, like a bunch of rules in the code about what things an IT coder can do when it regards to AI. And that bill was not passed, it was continued, and we'll talk about what it was continued to in a second. There were a couple other bills. One dealt with making it a crime to use artificial intelligence in the commission of a criminal offense. And some people say, well, isn't that already illegal? Yes, it is. It's kind of like the idea where if you rob a bank, that's illegal. But if you use a gun, it's kind of an add-on charge. And so somebody wanted to make using AI to commit a crime an add-on charge. There were some other bills making it a crime to create a videographic or still image using artificial intelligence of a non-consenting person to make them look like they're nude. So the idea would be to take somebody famous and put somebody else's naked body on them and then send that out, or to do the same for a minor. That bill was not passed. It wasn't killed either. It was continued to the next session. And then the last one was prohibiting the dissemination or sale of an item created with artificial intelligence that contains a videographic or still image intended to depict an actual person. So this is where someone creates uses artificial intelligence to make a fake Joe Biden or a fake Donald Trump or a fake Matthew McConaughey, pick your celebrity. And that bill was continued. All of them were continued next session.
That's a pretty broad range of bills and a lot of different topics. It sounds pretty complicated. So what happens to all of these? You talk about them being continued. What's the next step?
Well, this is actually a pretty common thing. Go back to the 90s when I was a delegate. I know it's hard to believe, but remember the internet just was invented in the 90s. There was only a few websites and people didn't even understand how the internet worked, and they would have a lot of bills being presented, but no one understood the internet back then. I'll give you some examples about things that we did not understand about the internet. We didn't know whether if you clicked yes on a screen, whether that created a contract or not. I mean, now, of course, everybody uses it every day. It seems obvious, but back then we didn't know that. We didn't know what jurisdiction it would exist if somebody had a contract between two people on the internet. Where would the lawsuits happen? All things like that. And so what we did was we carried those bills over for a year and created a study group to make sure that everybody understood what the internet was, how it works, and what the consequences of legislating on these topics would be. And fast forward to 2024, the same thing's happening with artificial intelligence. I'm not quite sure that anybody even really knows what artificial intelligence is. And so they continued it over for a group called JCOTS, Joint Commission on Technology and Science, to study these issues and then come up with some recommendations. And then next year, the legislature will be able to pass laws based upon actual knowledge of what we're talking about.
So yeah, I remember those early days of the internet. I've been practicing law when I took long enough to remember when that was the case. And yeah, there was a lot of legal issues and discussions and trying to figure out how existing law fits into this new concept, and then what new laws do you need to address it, and whether it needed to be a law or regulation or a policy or something in between, right? So there was a lot of discussion, and it does feel like we're in that period now with AI, with things moving real quickly. But I think some people have different understandings of AI. Maybe they're not understanding AI because it is such a technical and such a complex issue. But you mentioned this JCOTS. Can you talk a little bit about that, what it's comprised of and how they do their work?
Well, the legislature in Virginia has a bunch of commissions, and the reason is because it's a part-time legislature. When I was in it, I was a practicing attorney from March until December, and then I moved to Richmond and did the full-time legislature. So also in Virginia, the legislators don't have huge staffs. They have one person, one legislative assistant, much unlike Congress, where someone would have a legislative assistant dedicated to commercial transactions, one dedicated to foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a bunch of commissions that are comprised mostly of legislators and staff attorneys. One of those commissions that does studies on the off season, which is basically March to December, is called JCOTS, Joint Commission on Technology and Science. And it studies, and I'm going to read what the definition is here on the code, studies all aspects of technology and science and strives to encourage, promote, and assist in the development of sound technology, science, and policy in the Commonwealth. So this group will meet. They'll create a work group agenda, probably meet about 8 times. We'll get presentations from experts in the field and come up with some legislative recommendations. Obviously, for example, let's pick the easy one. No one wants people making videos of somebody's head on somebody else's body, and so they'll come up with a way to pass that which would solve the problem but not create more problems.
Okay. So what other issues might JCOTS consider, Dave? I mean, you listed a big broad list of topics and proposed legislation. It sounds like they have some authority and they have a certain amount of time to do it. So based on that, what do you expect they'll be considering?
The one concerning thing about the study is really only dealing with AI in government. So some of these crime issues they may or may not consider, but they're mandated to consider 3 things. I'm going to read it directly again from the code. The study is going to look at 1, govern the procurement, implementation, and ongoing assessment of any such policy by a public body. 2, ensure that no such system results in any unlawful discrimination or unlawful disparate impact against any individual group or individuals. And 3, require any public body to assess the likely impact of using such system and perform ongoing assessments to ensure that the use of such system does not result in unlawful discrimination. So basically 2 of these talking points are talking about using AI in a way that doesn't discriminate, probably in the constitutional sense, race, religion, color, sex, age, national origin, or disability. And then the other one would be using AI in government procurement. So those are the minimum things that the group's going to look at. I expect they'll look at the broader issues also, since they're already working.
And they have that authority to look more broadly?
Yeah, they do. It kind of depends on what kind of bandwidth they have for the study.
Sure.
But Kevin, I'm going to turn the tables on you and become the interviewer. The other big thing that happened this year was the governor created an executive order dealing with artificial intelligence and how the state uses it. And for people watching, the governor has broad authority to do things to run the government. The executive branch comes from the word execute, which means, executing the duties of the government. And so he passed a executive order dealing with AI. I read it and didn't understand it. I know that, but now that you know this stuff, so tell us a little bit about what happened with the governor's executive order.
Yeah, so it's interesting, Dave, because we're seeing this not just in Virginia, but other states are doing it, and then actually the federal government is doing it as well, right? So the legislative process, as you suggested, takes a while, and there's a lot of considerations before putting something into law. But these issues are important and quick, and so people are moving, trying to address them as best they can. And so this executive order came out of Governor Youngkin's office in January of this year, Executive Order number 30. And it does several different things related to AI, particularly the state agencies' use of AI. So it looks at information, it calls for further development of information technology standards, education guidelines, how schools and universities are going to use AI, how law enforcement is going to use AI, talking about procurement, like you said, also establishment of an AI task force to think about some of these issues, which I assume would be different than JCOTS because it'd be on the executive branch. But again, trying to focus on how the government can or should be using it at the state level. And then also called for VITA to develop policy standards. And these policy standards are intended to really focus on how government agencies are going to be procuring AI products. And so the executive order asked VITA to look at the guiding principles for ethical use of AI within the government, making sure there's a business case for AI, not just to have it because it's the latest, cool, sexiest technology, to make sure there's a business case. There's a mandatory approval process that VITA was directed to come up with in terms of making sure that the right folks were signing off on government procuring AI. Considerations around disclaimers in terms of when, particularly with respect to generative AI, the outputs, there were disclaimers that this perhaps came from AI and what that means, and then identifying third-party risks and how to mitigate those. So subsequent to the executive order, pretty shortly thereafter, VITA came out with these policy standards, and it's a pretty detailed list, and I don't want to go through all of them. And but for our audience, it's important to recognize that state agencies are only directed to use AI if there is a positive outcome for citizens of the Commonwealth, and it should be the optimal solution. It should be used only if it's the best solution and not simply to replace something at the same level it is today. There's a state registry that VITA is created, where state agencies are supposed to register what AIs they wanted to use and how it's going to be used. And that's to start partly because there's an approval process at both the agency level and then also within the executive office itself, in terms of making sure that these standards are met, making sure that the system, in addition to the process itself, has been approved, because they're looking at issues around, as you said, discrimination, ethical use of AI, because it is such a complicated and touches on so many areas. So there's this approval process that's in place, and they want to make sure that it's fair. And that's a pretty broad term, as in the legislature, trying to develop fairness in laws is really hard. But that's what they're one of the goals of this policy standard is intended to do. Another thing for our listeners to think about is they are also looking at whether there should be warranties that AI developers or deployers should put on their technology if there's going to be part of a government procurement.
What about things that Virginia companies or companies doing business in Virginia generally should know about the governor's executive order?
So I think beyond the executive order, one of the things that they need to be considering is, you're discussing the legislative process and what's taking place, and that is going to have its own pace. But right now, Virginia and other states and the federal government are able to say, okay, if you're going to do business with us, you need to follow these steps. whether they be best practices, whether you comply with the registry, whether you provide a warranty, whether that, what's fairness, what's non-discriminatory. I mean, all those things the agencies are looking to develop. And in my experience, those will work their way into other contracts as well. So understanding this is going to be important because some of these will migrate over to the commercial contracts as well. We've seen that with instance around privacy language or cybersecurity. I think we can see that with AI as well. But even beyond that, I think many businesses, even if you're not in the AI business yourself, if you're dealing with technology, for instance, with your software as a service provider, you want to make sure that you understand how they're using your data, whether they're using it for AI, and this would be both for contracts going forward. If you don't want them to do it, either for regulatory purposes or privacy purposes, you want to make sure that that language is addressed in your contract, and then also look at existing contracts to see if there's any prohibition in there now. So if certain providers have this right, you may want to check to see if they're doing it, and if you don't want them to, you probably need to consider how to deal with that. The other thing is, and from a due diligence standpoint, as you start to adopt new technology providers, I do think in addition to technical due diligence, from a legal standpoint, you're going to want to understand if they're using AI and how they're using it, because increasingly it seems like the law is developing that you're going to have to understand what your technology stack is and where AI is involved. Is it being used for sensitive purposes? Who is looking at the output when it comes out? Is there fairness, equality, non-discrimination? It's hard to do that if you don't understand where AI is in your stack and how it's being used. And even though there may not be a legal requirement to do it now, it's probably best to consider that going forward. So when you do get asked the questions, you can come up with the answers.
Yeah, so it sounds like where we are is like going back to what I was talking about in the 90s. Before the Uniform Computer Transactions Act was passed, it was like the Wild West. And people didn't really know how to use the internet, what was legal, what was not, what was required, what you could use, what you couldn't. And we're kind of in the same situation here, it sounds like, for a little bit at least. And so I guess that's pretty much wrapping up our session here today. I appreciate, Kevin, you telling me all about the executive order that I didn't understand. And and we'll have to stay tuned for actions in the legislature this summer and next session. But thanks very much for everybody for attending.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. This was great.